Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. This here is the version 1 of the Miyoo Mini. This one came out late last year, and to be honest, I initially wasn't a huge fan of the device. A lot of that had to do with the controls. I found that the D-pad was a little bit too squeaky and tight, and same thing with the face buttons. They rubbed against the side of the shell, and it just didn't make for a pleasant gaming experience. However, as custom firmware was introduced for the device, I started liking it more and more. And so despite having some initial issues with the controls, I just kind of learned to live with it. Well, flash forward to about 6 months later, they released the version 2 of the Miyoo Mini. They released a couple new colors for the device, like the transparent black option here, but most importantly, they fixed the controls. No longer do the face button and D-pad scrape against the sides of the device, they're actually very nice and pleasant to touch down on. When combined with advances in the Onion OS operating system, this device became the one to beat at its price point. In fact, it became so popular that it's sold out everywhere right now. Well, lately, if you go to the Miyoo website, you'll actually see that they're offering something they call the version 3. And I was lucky enough to find one in stock and I was able to buy it. And so in this video here, we're actually going to review the version 3 of the Miyoo Mini and see whether or not there's actually any difference between these two. And this has been a point of contention within the community for the past several months. I've seen some people saying, yes, the version 3 is definitely different than the others. But then also we have messages from Miyoo themselves saying there's no difference other than just a different marketing. And so I'm hoping to see today whether or not there is anything worth mentioning and a difference between whatever they're calling as a version 2 or a version 3 of the Miyoo Mini. Right off the bat, when it comes to pack-ins, everything else seems to be exactly the same as it was on the version 2. Same cable, instruction card, SD card reader, all that seems to be the same. And looking at the device here, you can see that I picked up the beige or gray version. This isn't really by choice. I think I would rather have had a new transparent black one, but all the same, this was the only one they had available. Either way, in direct comparison between the version 1 and the version 3, you can see here that the purple buttons are a little bit darker on the version 3. The text on the version 3 looks to be a little bit brighter of a blue, and the menu button looks a little bit different as well. Looking at the back, you can see that the beige or gray color is not the same between the two either. The new one seems to be a little bit lighter. Now, what's most important to me is the feel of the D-pad and the buttons. This is what you're going to be interacting with most on the device. And as far as I can tell, at least in my non-professional opinion, this feels exactly the same as it was on the version 2. And that is not a bad thing. I think this is great. The buttons are nice and clicky, the D-pad is nice and responsive, exactly what I would like. Now looking at the battery on the back case here, it does look a little bit different. It only has a sticker on one side and the sticker seems a little bit smaller. It is rated at 2000 milliamp hours, which is the same as the version 2 battery. This one has a larger sticker and stickers on both sides. The other stickers you're seeing on the back here are actually custom made by Sakura Retro Modding. I'll leave a link to their Etsy store in the video description. Now on the version 1 of the Miyoo Mini, it had a completely different battery. It was actually a battery pack and had no actual cable connecting it. This one was also rated for 1900 milliamp hours instead of 2000 on the others. So yeah, for all intents and purposes, yes, it feels distinctly different than the version 1 Miyoo Mini that I have, but it feels exactly the same as the version 2. And there may be some very slight variations that other people have noticed, but at least between these two models that I'm testing here, I can't tell a difference at all. So I would say rest assured, if you find any listing that says version 2 or version 3, the controls are going to be fantastic on it. So now let's take a look at the stock SD card and see if there's been any changes between the firmware or the card itself. At least upon initial boot up, everything looks exactly the same as it does on stock on the version 2. The easiest way to test if there's been any changes is to go into the settings here, and then we're going to go into device info, and as you can see, it's running the April 2022 version of the firmware. And that's great because that's the most updated version of the firmware available, which means you can use it with custom firmware like Onion OS or MiniUI. Looking at the game list, this does look to be about the same. Honestly, I'm not super familiar with the stock firmware just because I don't use it very often. But like with the other versions of the Miyoo Mini, this one does come loaded with a bunch of games. 785 Super Nintendo games, for example. It only comes with a few PlayStation games, but that makes sense because those are large files and this is only a 32GB card. But for everything else, there's quite a big selection. 291 Master System games, or 856 Game Boy Advance games. Now I'm 99.9% sure this is going to work just fine, but just in case, let's go ahead and add our Onion OS SD card, and yeah, it boots up just fine and looks great. So now let's compare onions and onions between version 2 and version 3 of these screens. I'm going to set both of them to a 5 out of 10 brightness, and then within the display settings, I'm not going to change anything from the defaults. So I'm going to leave gamma at 7 out of 20, and then the other three I'm going to leave at 10 out of 20. Now, as we get into the screen comparison, one caveat I want to make here is that every single Miyoo Mini screen seems to be a little bit different than the other. And so there are no standardized display settings that I would recommend for any Miyoo Mini across the board. It's really going to come down to your individual preference and experimenting with the display settings to find what you like the best. And so while I am going to compare these based on the default settings in the display menu, I really don't think this is a good comparison between the two. And that has more to do with the variation within each of these panels than anything to do with version 2 versus version 3. If I did the same with a number of version 2s or a number of version 3s, I would expect to see variance there as well. Either way, let's go ahead and start up the same game. So we'll do Super Mario World, and yes, this is both of them running on the same exact firmware, running the same exact default settings. And I would say between the two, it looks to me like the version 3 is a little bit more saturated than version 2, but it does not seem to be quite as bright as the version 2, and the tint seems to be a little bit on the green side, and the warmth seems to be a little bit on the yellow side as well. Again, these are all things that can be changed in the display settings, and so it's really not going to be a huge loss. And so yes, while there is a difference between these two screens, it is going to come down to a personal preference and then tweaking those visual settings. Honestly, it's pretty cool that the Miyoo Mini even has display settings in the first place, because most handhelds don't. Now, if we compare that against the version 1 screen, we will see some differences. Number one, the bezel on the version 1 screen is a little bit smaller, and you can definitely see that the hue here is skewed a lot more towards red than it is green. And so, long story short, when it comes to these screens, yes, I do detect a variance between the version 2 and the version 3. However, this is kind of the normal variance that I would expect between various Miyoo Mini models. And like I've mentioned, you can always adjust these settings to your own liking. Okay, last thing I want to test here is whether or not there's any difference in sound quality between the version 2 and the version 3. Again, I'm not expecting anything to be different, but it's always good to be thorough. So we'll start with the version 2 here. I'm going to turn it up to full volume. And so yeah, I think that does sound pretty good. There's a little bit of distortion when Mario is jumping, but again, we're playing this at full volume. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing with version 3. If I was to be super nitpicky, I think I can hear a little bit less detail in the version 3 than the version 2, but honestly that might not be anything, it might just be a placebo and I'm totally making that up. Now that being said, there are ways to upgrade these speakers, and I'll leave that for a future video. Anyway, that's really about it for this video. I just wanted to check out to see whether or not there's any difference between the version 3 and the version 2. And as I suspected, if there are any differences between the two, they are almost intangible. So long story short, if you can get your hands on a version 2 or a version 3, I think you're going to be exceedingly happy. It's really going to come down to availability, and I hope they start shipping out more soon. Either way, I'll leave a link to the Miyoo AliExpress page as well as keepretro.com. I would recommend checking these sites periodically to see if they have any in stock. For the most part, they usually only throw maybe 100 or so up at a time. Anyway, that's it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.